The morning of my ex-husband's funeral felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and forces you to listen to your own thoughts. I sat in my car outside the cemetery for several minutes before stepping out, my hands resting on the steering wheel as memories tried to pull me backward in time. I hadn't cried when I heard the news of his death. I hadn't even been shocked. What I felt was something heavier and harder to name, like an old wound suddenly reminding you it never truly healed. We had been divorced for 12 years, but before that, we had shared nearly 2 decades of life together. We met when neither of us had anything worth envying. He was ambitious, restless, always talking about the future as if it were a place he could conquer by sheer will. I believed in him more than anyone. I worked extra shifts, supported his ideas, ignored my own exhaustion because I was convinced that one day it would all be worth it. And for a while it was. The money came, then more money, and with it came distance, secrets, and finally betrayal. By the time I discovered the affair, he had already emotionally left our marriage. The woman who would later become his wife was younger, sharper, and far more impressed by his wealth than by the man himself. The divorce was quick, almost surgical. I didn't fight for much. I wanted out, not a battlefield. People assumed I walked away with nothing because I was weak or foolish. I let them believe that. As I walked toward the chapel, I could feel eyes following me. Some people recognized me instantly. Others whispered as if my presence were inappropriate, like I was a ghost who should have stayed buried in the past. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with perfume, polished wood, and quiet judgment. His photograph stood at the front, carefully chosen to show him at his most powerful and composed. It barely resembled the man I had once known. She stood near the front row, dressed flawlessly in black, diamonds resting casually against her skin as if mourning were just another social event. His wife, the woman who had replaced me in his life and in her mind, surpassed me in every possible way. When her eyes landed on me, a slow smile spread across her lips, not a polite one, not a kind one. It was the smile of someone who believed she had won. I took a seat near the back, keeping my posture straight, my expression neutral. I had not come to challenge anyone. I had not come to claim anything. I came because no matter how things ended, he had once been my husband, and some chapters of life demand to be closed properly. The service began. People spoke about his brilliance, his success, his generosity. They talked about the empire he built, the fortune he left behind, the legacy that would live on. Each word felt carefully rehearsed, polished to hide the less convenient truths. No one spoke about the nights he came home angry and empty, or the way success slowly hollowed him out. I listened without reacting, my hands folded tightly in my lap. When the service ended, people stood and moved outside in clusters, exchanging quiet condolences and business cards. I stepped out into the cold air, breathing a little deeper. That was when I heard her voice behind me, light and amused, deliberately loud enough for others to hear. "I hope you didn't come for his $39 million fortune," she said, followed by a laugh that made my stomach tighten. "Because you're getting nothing." Several people nearby turned to look. I faced her slowly. She looked pleased with herself, as if she had been waiting for this moment, the moment to remind me of my place. "You divorced him," she continued. "You walked away. Everything he had belongs to me now." Her confidence was absolute, unshakable, and for a brief second I almost felt sorry for her, though I didn't yet know why. I met her gaze calmly. "I didn't come for money," I said. She scoffed. "Everyone comes for money." Before she could say more, a man approached us, tall, silver-haired, composed. I recognized him instantly. He had been my ex-husband's lawyer for decades, the quiet architect behind many of his most ruthless business moves. His presence shifted the energy around us. "Excuse me," he said politely, though his tone allowed no argument. She smiled at him, already assuming she was the reason for his attention. But he didn't look at her. He looked at me. Then he held out a thick envelope, sealed and unmistakably official. "This is for you," he said. Time seemed to pause. Her smile vanished for her. She snapped. "Why would you give her anything?" He ignored the question. I took the envelope slowly, feeling its weight before I even opened it. Conversations around us faded into silence as curiosity spread. I broke the seal and pulled out the documents inside. I didn't need to read every word to understand what I was holding. My name was there, clearly printed, a legal trust established years ago, assets listed in precise detail. Conditions met, instructions executed. Her breathing turned uneven. She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page, and then she froze. "That's not possible," she whispered. Then louder, her voice cracking. "That's not possible." The lawyer finally spoke to her, his voice firm. "The documents are valid. Everything is in order." Her composure shattered instantly. She began shouting, accusing him, accusing me, her voice rising until it echoed across the cemetery. People stared openly now, shocked by the spectacle. She reached for the papers, but the lawyer stepped between us. I placed the documents back into the envelope carefully. I felt strangely calm, as if the storm she was experiencing had already passed through me years ago. "He promised me everything," she screamed, "everything." I looked at her, really looked at her, and understood something then. Promises meant very different things to different people. "He didn't," I said quietly. She screamed then, raw and uncontrolled, as the reality crashed down around her. I stood still, holding the envelope, aware that whatever had just begun was far bigger than a moment of humiliation. This was not the end of the story. It was only the first crack. I left the cemetery with the envelope pressed against my chest, not because I was afraid someone would snatch it away, but because it felt unreal, like it might vanish if I loosened my grip. Behind me, the sound of her screaming still echoed faintly, blending with the low murmur of shocked guests. No one tried to stop me. No one dared. For the first time in years, I felt invisible in the best possible way. In my car, I sat there for a long time without turning the key. My hands trembled now that I was alone, the delayed reaction finally catching up to me. I opened the envelope again, slower this time, forcing myself to read every page carefully. Dates jumped out at me first. The trust had been created 8 years ago, long before his illness, long before the accident that supposedly took his life, long before his second marriage even began, 8 years. That meant he had planned this while we were still legally strangers to each other, bound only by shared history and unspoken truths. The lawyer's voice replayed in my mind, calm and controlled, explaining that the trust had been activated automatically upon his death, non-contestable, sealed tight by clauses that left no room for interpretation. A significant portion of his fortune, assets hidden behind layers of companies and investments, had been placed under my name, not gifted out of sentiment, but secured with intent. I finally started the car and drove away, my thoughts spiraling faster than the traffic around me. People would assume this was revenge. They would assume I had manipulated something behind the scenes, but the truth was far more complicated and far more painful. We hadn't spoken in years, not really. After the divorce, our communication had been limited to brief, necessary exchanges, and even those faded with time. I rebuilt my life quietly. I moved to a smaller city, took a job that paid the bills but didn't consume my soul, and learned how to exist without the constant pressure of someone else's expectations. I thought he had forgotten me. I thought I was just a chapter he'd closed without a second thought. I was wrong. My phone buzzed as I pulled onto the highway. Unknown number. I already knew who it would be. I didn't answer. It buzzed again. And again. Then a message appeared. "This isn't over. You don't deserve any of it." I exhaled slowly and placed the phone face down on the seat beside me. Her words didn't hurt. They felt empty, like echoes bouncing around a hollow room. What unsettled me more was the realization that she truly hadn't known. She had lived in that mansion, spent that money, worn that confidence, believing everything was hers. And all this time, there had been a locked door she never even knew existed. That evening, the lawyer called and asked me to come to his office the next morning. He said there were additional matters to discuss. The tone of his voice suggested this was only the surface. His office was exactly as I remembered it: dark wood, shelves lined with thick legal volumes, the air heavy with quiet authority. He gestured for me to sit and slid another folder across the desk. "There are conditions," he said. I nodded. I had expected that. The trust was structured to protect assets from impulsive decisions and external pressure, He continued, "You will have full control, but not immediately. Some portions are time-locked, others are tied to specific actions." "What kind of actions?" I asked. He studied me carefully before answering. He wanted you to see everything, to understand everything. The folder contained letters, handwritten. My breath caught when I recognized his handwriting, sharp and familiar. The lawyer explained that these letters were to be released to me only after his death, only if the trust transferred successfully. I took the folder home and didn't open it until late that night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that amplifies your thoughts until they become unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the first letter. He didn't apologize, not directly. Instead, he wrote about regret in abstract terms, about mistakes made in pursuit of ambition, about realizing too late that some losses cannot be replaced by wealth. He wrote about watching from a distance as I rebuilt my life, about resisting the urge to interfere because he believed he had already caused enough damage. The second letter was harder to read. He admitted he had never trusted anyone around him the way he had trusted me, that success had surrounded him with people who loved what he could give them, not who he was. He wrote that his second marriage had been built on admiration, not understanding, on illusion, not truth. By the third letter, my hands were shaking. He wrote about fear, about knowing that if anything happened to him, his wife would tear his empire apart within months. Lawsuits, power struggles, reckless spending. He had watched her closely and seen what others refused to see. So I protected what mattered. The letter read, and I put it in the hands of the only person I know who never wanted it. Tears blur my vision, not because I forgave him, but because understanding arrived too late to fix anything. He hadn't done this to punish her. He had done it to ease his own conscience. Over the next few days, the calls began. Distant relatives, former business partners, people who hadn't spoken my name in years suddenly remembered I existed. And then there were her calls, dozens of them. Voicemails that shifted from rage to pleading to threats and back again. She accused me of stealing her future. She accused me of manipulation. She promised court battles that would leave me ruined. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than any words I could offer. What she didn't know yet was that the trust wasn't the only surprise waiting for her. There were layers to his plan, pieces set to fall into place one by one. And when they did, the screaming she'd started at the funeral would sound like nothing compared to what was coming next. By the end of the first week, my name was no longer just my name. It had become a rumor, a headline whispered through boardrooms and whispered louder through family gatherings that suddenly wanted me present again. I felt it in the way my phone vibrated endlessly, in the unfamiliar caution in people's voices when they spoke to me, as if I had transformed overnight into someone dangerous. Wealth does that. Even the idea of it reshapes how others see you. I kept my routine unchanged on purpose. I still woke early, still made my coffee the same way, still drove myself instead of hiring anyone. It was my way of staying anchored, of reminding myself that the envelope hadn't rewritten who I was. But the world around me refused to play along. The lawyer called again, asking me to come in, his tone more serious than before. When I arrived, I noticed something new in his office. 2 additional men seated near the window, both dressed in expensive suits, both watching me like I was a puzzle they hadn't yet solved. "These are trustees," the lawyer explained. "Independent, appointed to oversee certain transitions." Transitions. The word landed heavily. He laid out documents that mapped an empire far larger than I had understood from the first envelope. Companies nested inside companies, offshore accounts, properties registered under shell corporations. My ex-husband hadn't just accumulated wealth, he had engineered it like a fortress, and at the center of that structure, hidden in plain sight, was me. "There's more," the lawyer said. "Your name appears on several corporate boards, silent positions established years ago. They activate now." I stared at him. "That's not possible. I would have known." "They were structured so you wouldn't," he replied. "At the time, you were the safest option, untouchable, uninterested." It dawned on me then that while I had been rebuilding my quiet life, he had been building something around me, using my absence as protection. The irony was bitter enough to taste. That afternoon, I received my first formal invitation. An emergency board meeting. One of his flagship companies was in turmoil. Investors were nervous. His wife had attempted to assert control and failed spectacularly. According to the documents, she had expected unanimous loyalty. Instead, she had been met with silence, then resistance. I didn't want to go. Every instinct told me to stay hidden, to let professionals handle it, but the lawyer was clear. If you don't show up, he said, others will decide what you become. So I went. The building was glass and steel, towering and cold. As I entered the boardroom, conversation stopped. Faces turned. Some were shocked, others were wary. A few looked relieved. There was an empty chair at the head of the table, and without thinking, I took it. No one objected. She arrived late. The moment she saw me sitting there, her face twisted with something close to disbelief. She tried to mask it, smoothing her expression into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "This is inappropriate," she said, placing her purse down sharply. "She doesn't belong here." One of the trustees cleared his throat. "Actually, she does." What followed wasn't shouting. It was worse. Controlled voices, legal language, facts laid out like weapons. Her authority dissolved piece by piece as documents surfaced proving she held far less power than she believed. Her shares were smaller. Her voting rights limited. Temporary, conditional. She tried to interrupt, tried to charm, tried to threaten. None of it worked. For the first time, I saw fear replace arrogance entirely. She realized she wasn't fighting me. She was fighting a system designed to exclude her. After the meeting, she cornered me in the hallway. Her composure cracked again, tears streaking her mascara. "You planned this," she hissed. "You manipulated him. You always did." I looked at her calmly. "I didn't even know," she laughed bitterly. "That's what makes it worse. That night, someone tried to break into my house. The police said it was likely opportunistic, but I knew better. The timing was too precise. The lock's damage too deliberate. Fear crept in then, real and cold. I realized that money didn't just bring power. It brought danger, and whoever my ex-husband had been protecting me from wasn't just his wife. Security was arranged quickly. Temporary, then permanent. My quiet life was officially over. Days later, another letter arrived, delivered by courier, sealed and marked confidential. This one wasn't from the lawyer. It was from a private investigator my ex-husband had hired years ago. Inside were reports, photographs, financial trails. I sat on the floor as I read them, my back against the couch, my chest tightening with every page. His wife hadn't just been careless with money. She had been laundering it, moving funds without authorization, paying off people whose names were followed by criminal records and sealed cases, and she wasn't alone. The investigator's notes suggested a larger network, one that my ex-husband had been quietly dismantling before his death. The trust wasn't just a gift, it was a firewall, and now that firewall belonged to me. The phone rang late that night, unknown number again. This time I answered. "You think you've won," she said, her voice low and shaking, "but you don't understand what you've stepped into." "I'm starting to," I replied. There was silence on the line before she spoke again, almost pleading. "If you expose them, they'll destroy you." I closed my eyes. They already tried. She hung up without another word. In the following weeks, subpoenas were issued. Accounts frozen. Investigations reopened. The media caught wind of it, spinning stories about betrayal, secret trusts, a mysterious ex-wife who emerged from nowhere to inherit an empire. My face appeared on screens I'd never wanted to see myself on. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I let the truth move at its own pace, because I finally understood something my ex-husband had learned too late. Power isn't about how loudly you speak. It's about how little you have to say when everything starts collapsing around others. And hers was collapsing fast. The first time I saw my name printed across a news screen, I felt a strange detachment, as if they were talking about someone else entirely. Commentators speculated about motives, about secret deals, about a mysterious past that had suddenly resurfaced to claim its prize. Some painted me as a gold digger who had played the long game. Others framed me as a wronged woman finally receiving justice. None of them were right. The truth didn't fit neatly into any headline. What unsettled me most was how quickly the world adjusted to the idea of me having power. Doors opened without hesitation. Invitations arrived daily. People who once looked through me now watched every move I made, waiting for direction. It was intoxicating in a dangerous way, and I reminded myself constantly that I hadn't sought this position. It had been forced upon me by a man who loved control even in death. The investigations gained momentum. Regulators requested documents. Former executives suddenly remembered things they had conveniently forgotten before. Accounts tied to his wife were frozen one by one, and with each freeze, her public appearances became rarer. When she did appear, she looked thinner, sharper, as if stress were carving her down to something brittle. She tried one last time to confront me privately. A request came through my assistant, still a concept that felt unreal, asking for a meeting without lawyers, without witnesses. Every instinct told me to refuse, but curiosity won. I agreed to meet in a quiet restaurant on the edge of the city, neutral territory where neither of us held an obvious advantage. She arrived early, already seated, her hands wrapped tightly around a glass of water. When she looked up at me, I barely recognized her. The confidence was gone, so were the diamonds. "You've ruined everything." She said as soon as I sat down. I didn't respond. Silence, I had learned, was more effective than defense. "They're coming after me," she continued, her voice trembling despite her attempt at control. "They're going to take everything, the house, the accounts, all of it." "They were never really yours," I said. Her eyes flashed with anger. "You think you're better than me. You think you deserved him more." The question surprised me, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so painfully human. For the first time, I saw her not as my enemy, but as someone who had built her identity on the same unstable foundation I once had. Him. "This isn't about deserving," I said. "It never was." She leaned forward, desperation spilling out. "Help me, you can stop this, you have the power." I studied her face, searching for sincerity. I found fear, regret, and something else, self-preservation stripped bare. There was no remorse for what she had done, only terror at being exposed. "I won't protect you," I said quietly, "but I won't destroy you either." She laughed bitterly. "You already have." I left the restaurant knowing that was the last time we would ever speak as equals. Whatever happened next would be decided by forces far larger than either of us. That night, I opened the final letter he had left for me. I had been avoiding it, sensing its weight. This one was shorter than the others, written in a hand that wavered slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote. "This isn't an apology. It's a responsibility. I am leaving you what I couldn't fix, because I trust you to finish what I started, not out of revenge, out of necessity." Attached was a list of charitable foundations, employee pensions, and small companies that depended on the stability of his empire to survive. People who would lose everything if the structure collapsed. He hadn't chosen me out of love. He had chosen me out of trust. The following weeks were relentless. Meetings blurred together. Decisions carried consequences that affected thousands of lives. I learned quickly, relying on advisors but never surrendering final judgment. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that his wife had been a symptom, not the disease. Corruption had seeped in long before her, festering quietly. One evening, as I reviewed financial reports, the lawyer called with urgency in his voice. "She's been arrested," he said. The words settled slowly. "Charged with financial crimes, conspiracy, obstruction. Bail denied." The news broke within hours, spreading like wildfire. Her face flashed across screens again, this time without makeup, without composure, escorted by officers who didn't care about her past status. I felt no satisfaction, only a heavy finality. The empire stabilized. Markets calmed, employees kept their jobs, the charities received funding that had been promised and delayed for years. Piece by piece, the damage was contained. Late one night, alone in my house, I poured a glass of wine and stood by the window. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to feel everything at once. The anger, the grief, the understanding, the exhaustion. He had orchestrated this ending with precision, but the final chapter wasn't his to write. It was mine. After her arrest, the noise that had surrounded my life for months began to fade, not all at once, but gradually, like a storm retreating toward the horizon. The media moved on, hungry for newer scandals. Analysts stopped calling. Boardrooms no longer held emergency meetings at midnight. On paper, stability had returned, but inside me, everything was still shifting, rearranging itself into something unfamiliar. For the first time since the funeral, I was forced to confront a question I had avoided since the envelope touched my hands. What was I supposed to do now when the crisis that had demanded all my focus was finally over? Power has a strange aftertaste. It doesn't leave you exhilarated the way people imagine. It leaves you exhausted, cautious, and deeply aware of how fragile everything really is. I had spent months making decisions that affected thousands of lives, people who would never know my face or my name, but whose futures bent quietly around choices I made in silent rooms. I had learned restraint the hard way. Every impulse to act quickly had been tempered by the understanding that haste was often just another form of arrogance. Her trial progressed without drama. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records intercepted communications, witnessed testimony from people who had once sworn loyalty to her. Each revelation stripped away another layer of the persona she had built so carefully. By the time the verdict came, no one was surprised. Guilty on multiple counts, a sentence long enough to erase the illusion that she would ever return to the world she once ruled. I watched the verdict on a muted screen in my office, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't trust my emotions. There was no triumph in watching someone fall that far, only a quiet, sobering recognition of how easily lives collapse when built on deception. When the screen went dark, I returned to work. There were still things that needed to be finished. The empire my ex-husband had left behind was no longer just his. It had become a responsibility that outlived him, something that demanded stewardship rather than control. I restructured leadership, dissolving boards that existed only to protect old loyalties and replacing them with people who valued transparency over proximity to power. It wasn't glamorous work. It was methodical, often thankless, and painfully slow. But it mattered. One afternoon, while reviewing long-term projections, I found myself staring out the window, watching people walk freely through the city below. I realized then how disconnected I had been from ordinary life. I couldn't remember the last time I had gone to a grocery store without security or answered my phone without calculating risk. Somewhere along the way, survival had replaced living. That realization unsettled me more than any threat ever had. I began stepping back, not abruptly, but deliberately. Systems were put in place to function without my constant presence. Trust managers were granted authority with clear boundaries. Decision-making power was distributed instead of concentrated. For the first time, I was doing something my ex-husband had never been able to do. I was letting go. The house he had shared with her became a symbol I could no longer tolerate. Not because of her, but because it represented everything that had gone wrong. Excess built to impress, silence disguised as luxury. I sold it quietly, refusing offers that came with publicity attached. The proceeds were allocated according to a plan that prioritized people over prestige. Employee funds that had been neglected were restored. Long, delayed obligations were fulfilled without announcements or ceremonies. I kept my own life intentionally small. I moved to a place where no one knew my history, where my name carried no weight and invited no assumptions. I chose a modest home with more light than space, one that felt human rather than imposing. I learned the rhythms of my new neighborhood slowly, morning walks, familiar faces, conversations that didn't revolve around money or influence. For the first time in years, I slept through the night. On a quiet afternoon, I visited the cemetery again, not on an anniversary, not on a meaningful date, just because I felt ready. I stood where his name was carved into stone and allowed myself to feel everything I had suppressed. The love that had once been real, the anger that had burned for years, the disappointment that had shaped so many of my choices. I didn't speak to him. I didn't ask questions. I simply acknowledged what had been and what would never be again. Closure, I learned, is not a moment. It is a decision. Weeks later, I received a letter from prison. Her handwriting was unsteady, stripped of the confidence that once defined her. She didn't accuse me. She didn't beg. She wrote about silence, about how loud it becomes when there is nothing left to distract you from your own thoughts. She wrote that she finally understood how fragile her world had been, how dependent it was on illusions she mistook for control. I read the letter once and put it away. not out of cruelty, but because her understanding no longer required my involvement. The final portion of the trust was released without fanfare, no lawyers present. No dramatic reveal, just a confirmation sent through secure channels, precise and emotionless. I stared at the numbers longer than I expected to, not because I wanted them, but because I needed to understand what they represented. Potential, responsibility, choice, I chose restraint. Instead of expanding my lifestyle, I expanded something quieter. I established a foundation with no public face, designed to operate without tying its impact to a single name. It funded legal support for people navigating financial betrayal, particularly those discarded after marriages built on imbalance and control. It supported education for individuals forced to start over later in life, when opportunity often feels out of reach. I didn't attend galas, I didn't accept awards. The work didn't need witnesses to be meaningful. Gradually, my days began to feel like my own again. I cooked, I read, I allowed boredom back into my life and discovered how peaceful it could be. There were moments when I laughed unexpectedly, startled by the sound as if it belonged to someone else. But it was mine. Sometimes late at night, the memory of the funeral returned to me with startling clarity. The way she had laughed, the certainty in her voice when she told me I would get nothing. At the time, she believed wealth was the only currency that mattered. She was wrong. What I gained couldn't be measured or transferred or contested in court. I gained distance from a past that had once defined me. I gained the freedom to choose a life not built in reaction to someone else's choices. I didn't win, I didn't lose. I simply stepped out of a story that no longer deserved to own me. And that, more than money, more than power, was the inheritance that finally set me free.